And welcome back to another video in the 2021 Giveaway Wrangler build series. And today, we're going to be lifting this hella yellow Wrangler using a Teraflex RT2 2.5-inch suspension kit. The Teraflex RT2 2.5-inch suspension kit comes with 2.5-inch lift springs, a full set of 8 of the Alpine IR control arms, front and rear adjustable track bars, a set of front speed bumps, and we're gonna match it up with a set of Falcon SP2 shocks. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of parts to install, so let's get this Jeep up on the rack. Now, one of the first things we're gonna do before we start any lift is we're gonna get some baseline measurements. So this back corner here, we're at 30 7/8. Now, to make sure we have a good baseline measurement, we're gonna measure from the bottom edge of the wheel straight up and then measure to the lowest part of the fender. And don't be surprised if you see different measurements from side to side on the vehicle. It's often the case. You're gonna see something an 1/8 inch out, a 1/4 inch out, even a 1/2 inch out, and you really don't notice it on the vehicle while it's just sitting there. Now we're going to start with the rear track bar, and you may notice things a little different than yours is that we've already installed a Grimm heavy-duty bolt kit in this JL. Now, if you're doing this in your driveway, you're going to have the frame up on jack stands, and then you're going to use your floor jack to lift and lower the axle to move parts around. Now, to get to the top of the shock, we need to move this panel right here. We've got 3 bolts that use an 8mm. Pop your breather off, and if you have a Rubicon axle, make sure you disconnect your locker harness. Now we're going to move on to our control arms, and we're going to do them one at a time. One way you can help make sure you get them exactly the same is use your bolts, and they should slide right in. Take our bump stop base plate, and we want to use these inner holes and push these holes towards the outside of the vehicle. The Teraflex bump stop is pretty cool because all you have to do is just add up how many spacers you need. You have your base spacer that's 2-inch, and then add 1/2-inch spacers until you get to the amount of lift you have. We've got a 2.5-inch lift, so that's what we're gonna go with, is a 2-inch and a 1/2-inch. Set that down into place. And then we have this threaded plate here. It's gonna slip right in. Next up is our upper bump stops. Just pop the stock one out and grab the new Teraflex and pop them in. Teraflex includes a raised track bar bracket for the rear. Want to slide it into place and use your original track bar bolt just to line it up. Then use a center punch or a transfer punch. And we're going to drill them out to 1/2-inch. On the lower hole, it gets really tight up against the brake caliper. So just make sure you straighten up the hole. So now we're going to go up to our 1/2-inch bit. Insert the track bar spacer through the original bolt hole. For our Falcon SP2 shocks, we're going to anchor the top end first. Now the SP2s are adjustable, and if we rotate 360 degrees counterclockwise, that is the softer of the two settings. If we rotate it 360 degrees clockwise, that's the performance setting. It's going to be a little bit firmer. Although this vehicle is very stock, we will be adding front and rear bumpers, bigger tires, so we might as well set it at the performance setting to begin with. We always reverse the shock bolts so our threaded end is poking in towards the wheel. That'll protect it a little bit more from trail damage. All right, now we've got the rear done, except for the rear track bar. We're gonna wait until we have the whole suspension done and we can set the vehicle down on all fours, and it'll make setting those track bars in front and rear a lot easier. One thing I find really silly is Jeep's got this nice little cutout for the shock on this inner fender, but it doesn't go high enough to get at that bolt. And you can bend it up out of the way to get to it, but then this just gets all bent up. So I find it just as easy to grab a box knife and just trim it. Depending on the shock you put in, you may end up trimming quite a bit of it out. Pop the vent line off. If you have a Rubicon locker, you need to unplug that here also. Disconnect that. And then we're gonna run our trim tool in and pop the Christmas trees out. Once we have the lift kit all installed, the brake lines are going to be too tight. So we need to open up these brackets here to get the brake lines out so that they can move out around the shock. Pop the ABS lines out. They're held in with those little Christmas tree clips. So just be real careful not to damage the brake line. Just pry the bracket up until the brake line can come out. Once we have the hose out, we can remove that bracket. Just pull the little 10mm bolt out from the side. And that can go away. Hey! Yeehaw. And that bracket's gone. Now our brake lines and ABS lines are loose. We have a lot more room for the suspension travel. And once we have our shocks in, we can mount the Teraflex brake line relocation kit in place, and they will hold these lines nice and steady. Measure from the edge of one hole to the next, 24 1/8 inch. Now you want to keep this gap here fairly level, and we'll do final torque of these bolts once the arms are in the vehicle. Now we have the factory arm and the new Teraflex Alpine IR arm next to each other. And the IR stands for independent rotation, and they're talking about their new bushings. These bushings are pretty trick. They have a hardened inner sleeve, but the internal bushing will allow it to move without stressing this inner bushing. The factory bushing, everything is bonded together. And so once we clamp this, that holds the arm in place, and any articulation of the arm moving it at all that flex is going to come through this rubber, which puts a lot of stress on that bushing. With the 360-degree bushing and sleeve assembly in the new Teraflex IR joints, they allow this arm to move 360 degrees, which is going to give you less binding as you are flexing the suspension. Another great thing about these bushings is that they're factory lubricated and sealed, so you don't have to do anything with them, and they come with a lifetime warranty. £15, baby. All right. The Teraflex Speedbumps for this 2.5-inch kit have a 2-inch stroke and can hold up to 4 times more load than the factory bump stop. The factory bump stop's just a little over 1.5 inches in height, and it's pretty soft, so it's quite easy to bottom this out, to actually compress it all the way to where you go full solid up against the metal mount. And that's going to give you a very jarring ride. I'm going to start by removing the factory bump stop. Grab it and pull and twist. And there it pops out. Measure up 2 inches from the bottom. Let's just make a scratch mark. 2 inches from the bottom. Now we need to trim the bottom of this bump stop mount off. You can use multiple tools, a Sawzall, a cutting wheel. You can also pick up these exhaust tubing cutters from your local auto parts store. Okay, so the speed bump comes up through, and then we slide this collar down on it and clamp it in place. So we've got more inner fender liner to cut out of the way. Slide your speed bumps up. Take a Sharpie, make a little mark. Now we want to coat everything below that mark in black silicone. Slide our collar up on top. Go in, make sure you get the little pit down in the factory hole. Now with the front axle drooped all the way down to where it's binding, we went to put the spring in, and the spring is too tall to be able to get in underneath the speed bump and up into the pocket. So we go to look to the source of our bind, and what's happening is the clamp on the Alpine arms are hitting the bracket on the axle. Now, this isn't just a Teraflex thing. Many lift kit companies, depending on their arms or their ends of the arms, actually have a problem with this bracket. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna drop that end of the arm out, and then we're gonna come in here and we are going to cut this bracket just to give a little bit extra room around that arm. That'll allow the axle to drop down farther so we can get the coil spring in and out. Now that we got the spring in place, we can slide our lower bump stop mount in. Take your Christmas trees off the ABS lines. And then we're going to install the Teraflex brake line relocation brackets. These are really nifty little buggers. Put them underneath your shock bolt. We're going to slide our ABS line down inside and then the brake line. So we have this rubber guard right here. So let's get that out of the way. You want to be really careful doing this. You do not want to hurt that ABS line. Now if you look at the side profile, that ABS line drops right down inside. And then as does the brake line. Then we're going to take these zip ties and then grab a pair of flush cuts and cut your zip ties. And now you've got everything under control. And of course, once we get this down, we can always readjust this up if we need to. That'll keep all your brake lines up and out of the way. For our quick release sway bar links, they're gonna slide right in place of where the factory sway bar goes and even use the factory sway bar hardware. And on the passenger side, we're gonna slip our bolt in. Now, they want you to use the factory bolt again, but we went and found one that's a little bit shorter, just to look a little bit better. Then in goes our bullet pins. That's a click we were wanting to hear. We take the smaller of the studs and put them on the L-shaped brackets. Install the Zerk fittings in the bottom of the sway bar links. This is our Teraflex quick release sway bar link kit installed, and it's perfect for those of you who don't have a Rubicon model where you can just hit a button and disconnect your sway bar. What you do here is you're going to pull your release pin, pop your sway bar link off the mounting pins. We're going to hold our sway bar up, and you need to have both sides disconnected to do this. And then we'll slide it up onto the park pin. Put our safety pin in place and do the same for the other side. Okay, as we go to put our bumper panels back in the back, we'll notice it's right in against the shock. So let's do a little trimming. Now, I'm not too sure why we're worried about those panels because, well, we're going to rip that stock bumper off and put something else on anyway. Now to make sure that our track bar is in the right place, we need to take a couple measurements. Now this is an adjustable track bar, so we need to make sure that we have the axle centered underneath the body. So what we're going to do is measure from the frame straight out and pick a spot on the tire that you can replicate on the other side. This one here is 12 7/8 of an inch. Now if we go to the other side and we measure the same spot, we're right about 13.5. So we actually need to move the body this way or shorten that track bar about 1/4 of an inch. For the rear of the JL, the adjustable part of the track bar is up at the frame end. We want to make sure our pinch bolts are loose. Thirteen and an eighth spot on. And here we're at 13.25. Okay, so now we can come in here and measure. We're 13 and just over 1/8 of an inch. And then 13 and just over 1/8 of an inch. Now we're good there, but keep in mind that once we get driving this vehicle and we settle those springs down in, that's going to adjust that track bar measurement. So when you go and do your 500-mile retorque of all your suspension bolts, make sure everything's tight. You also want to check that track bar dimension, make sure that the body and the axle are centered on each other. We want to tighten up the pinch bolts, then we want to torque them to 60 foot-pounds. And being that they're side by side, we want to torque them the same amount evenly. And now repeat the process in the front. Now another example of Teraflex B, the new forged track bar, feels like it weighs about 3 times the weight of a factory track bar. And let's show you why. And there you go, that's the problem with the factory track bars. They're hollow, they're thin wall. These things flex, they move, and then they're just crimped on to the ends. You get a lot of movement out of these, and this is why we always recommend that you replace your track bars with an aftermarket track bar, and the Teraflex forged units are really nice and really burly. Perfect. Ooh. So here is the Teraflex RT2 suspension lift installed on the 2021 Hella Yella Giveaway Wrangler. Now as we take a closer look at it, let's go over a few of the pitfalls we found while we were installing the kit. Now one of the first things you saw us do was to disconnect the track bar bolts, but we did that when the vehicle was already on the lift. But we're telling you right now, it's a lot easier if you disconnect those track bar bolts while your vehicle's sitting on the ground and that suspension is not loading and pulling on that track bar. Now we had installed the Grimm replacement suspension bolt kit in a complete separate video. And then you saw us again remove it, put the suspension in, and put those bolts back in place. Well, installing a lift is the perfect time to install the Grimm replacement suspension bolt kit if you don't have one yet. And speaking of the Grimm bolt kit, all our torque values that we listed here with the Grimm bolts were for the Grimm bolt kit. So if you're still running the factory suspension bolts, make sure that you're retorquing them to factory spec. Then you saw us mark and cut those front control arm brackets on the front axle. And that was to clear the pinch brackets on the Teraflex IR arms. Now this is common with almost all aftermarket arms, And so it might be something you want to do before you even install the arms. It'll just save you a little bit of time. Then while we're installing the Teraflex Speedbumps, we use that steel tubing cutter or exhaust tubing cutter to cut the bump stop mounts. It gives you a really nice clean cut, but it does take a while and a little bit of arm work. So I think next time we do one, we'll be using a cutoff wheel. It'll be a lot faster. And then as mentioned before, once you have 500 miles on your new suspension, or you've got a couple wheeling trips, make sure that you check the torque on everything. Things will loosen up, especially when you've gone off-road. So if you're looking for a lift for your Wrangler JL, take a closer look at the Teraflex RT series lift kits. They offer them in 2.5, 3.5, and 4.5 inch lift heights. And you'll find links for those kits down in the description box below. You'll also find a link to where you can enter to win this Hella Yella Giveaway Wrangler. And then hit up that comment section and let us know. What should we be putting on this tire-wise? 35s or 37s? Thanks for watching our video. We'll see you in the next one.